go through my agenda. I am going to take a brief look at the global outlook, given that Canada is a export-oriented country. Manufacturing is a pretty heavily trade-dependent industry. So what happens in manufacturing, is determined to some extent by what's happening across overseas and across our borders. I'm gonna focus on focusing on some Canadian data for now. Labor market issues. I'm gonna look at some of the areas of challenge for the manufacturing sector. That includes labor shortages. We'll look and see what's happening there. Inflation obviously is a hot topic. Supply chains, those things go hand in hand, and we'll see where we're at there. I'll look at a Canadian outlook, a Canadian manufacturing outlook, and then I decided I'm gonna sometimes I sprinkle Newfoundland Labrador stuff throughout the presentation, but I think I'm just gonna save it for the end because I put Newfound. I missed land there. Sorry about that. I did that quick yesterday. Anyway, and then I'll go into the CME advocacy strategy, and of course save time for a Q&A. So the global outlook. Now it's actually, I don't know, relatively speaking, good news. What I'm using here is various international agencies release world economic outlooks from time to time, and this is the one that just came out from the IMF 2 weeks ago. And they actually over the last year or so, there's been a consistent downgrade in outlooks heading into 2023. Every time an agency released a forecast, it was like, "Ooh, it's going to be worse next year than we thought. It's going to be worse next year than we thought." But this time, it's actually they actually upgraded their outlook. So when they did the last time IMF did the forecast in October, they expected global economic growth to come in at 2.7% this year, and the forecast just released 2 weeks ago, or last week, in fact, they said, "Oh no, we think it's going to be closer to 2.9%." So a modest upgrade, and also growth they expect growth to pick up to 3.1% next year. So there's about 3 reasons for their relative optimism. One, they've upgraded their outlook for China quite sharply, actually, and it has mostly all to do with the fact that the government recently abruptly abandoned their zero COVID policy. And there's actually been a surge in, you can look at all the economic numbers over the last month. There's been a surge in travel, like jet fuel demand's just flying off the charts right now. People are finally able to travel across the country, and they're taking advantage of that. So it's really boosting demand for several things, including oil. Another thing there we've seen is that people were really worried about Europe heading to the winter. There could be shortages of natural gas and a gas crisis. That fortunately hasn't come to pass. European countries did a really good job of storing extra gas heading into the winter, obviously because they're not trying to avoid buying anything from Russia. And lo and behold, the winter's been really, really warm in Europe so far, so there hasn't been, the usage has been quite low relative to historical precedent. Third, the U.S. economy has been revised up too. It's actually, and that's a lot to do with the fact that just the data coming in over the last few weeks has been stronger than anyone anticipated, including, if anyone saw last Friday, the December employment data came out, and it was really, really strong. Like 500,000 jobs were created. The unemployment rate fell to its lowest point since the last time the unemployment rate was this low in the U.S. People were walking on the moon. So it's been a long time. Now we still have a lot of issues. A lot of they do say the risk to this outlook is tilted quite to the downside, including what we don't know. We still have a pretty significant European war happening. Right now, it's a bit of a stalemate because of the winter, but that's probably going to pick up again in the spring. There's also, we don't know what's going to happen with the COVID outbreaks in China. There's a lot of stories about, a lot of illness and death there. So we don't know if that's going to have any effect, which could lead to, potential supply chain snarls again. And I would also say, just to we're finding out with the data coming in stronger than expected, even though interest rates are really high and we have really high inflation. It just, I think it goes to show, this is me being deadly honest here, is that we don't, economists know very little about, how an economy recovers from a pandemic. We don't really have a lot of historical precedents from which to use. So we're kind of flying a little bit blind here. So one more slide on the world, kind of a world outlook. Just going to nerd out here a bit. It's fun to have a chart that goes back to 1871, but you do hear a lot of talk about reshoring, friendshoring, deglobalization, and I'll talk a little bit more about reshoring later. But this is a good chart just to show, it's a visual representation of globalization going back to basically 1871, the industrial, start of the Industrial Revolution. And this is a really good way to represent globalization. It's trade activity as a share of global GDP. And you can see most part it's been increasing over time. And the data are showing that, yes, we are in fact in a period of deglobalization. You can see ever since the global financial crisis, it's really the trend has been going mostly down. And so this would be the era we're living in now, the first period of deglobalization since the World War era, the World War I, World War II, and Great Depression era between about 1914 and then 1945, which was also marked by a pandemic. Maybe not coincidentally, but now what we've seen since about 2008, you have the global financial crisis that resulted in very weak recovery. We had Brexit. I probably should have mentioned Trump. Of course, we had COVID, the Russian-Ukraine invasion, and of course, this concern around China and trying to, they joined the WTO, and there's hope that they were going to democratize and that and become a force for good, and that hasn't really happened. So that's also pushing us towards an era of deglobalization. So just something to think about as we consider what's going to happen over the next 10 to 20 years. So labor market. Well, I'm sure everyone knows that lack of workers is a major challenge for manufacturers. So I'll just show some slides on that and see if we made any progress of late. So the first slide here is our results from recent CME surveys. Dave mentioned that we do surveys from time to time, and usually once a year we focus on labor challenges, and this is what we've done. This is the one we did just late last year or in the fall. So the thing to point out here, if you look at data going back to 2016, labor short. This is the red bars represent the percentage of manufacturers that say they are facing labor and skill shortages today or at the time that the survey was conducted, and we can see that it's been pretty high for the most part, especially if you look at 2018 and 2020, the majority of firms faced shortages. But the other thing to notice is that it's really become an even bigger challenge since the pandemic. So we're in both the 2021 and 2022 surveys, basically the same share of manufacturers, over 80% said, yeah, we're facing labor and or skill shortages today. So definitely a huge challenge. Another way to look at demand for labor in manufacturing is to look at how many job vacancies there are or job openings. And we can see that we had record numbers of job openings in 2020 through halfway through 2021 and about mid 2022, close to over 90,000 job vacancies. In fact, getting close to, approaching almost 100,000 job vacancies in manufacturing last year and into 2021. You can see it's way up since before the pandemic. And in the 2015s and 2016s, you're looking at maybe around roughly 40,000 vacancies. So more than doubling. Now you have seen these numbers come down in recent months, which isn't a surprise. In October, there are about 80,000 job vacancies. Not a huge surprise, because this is exactly what the Bank of Canada is trying to accomplish by raising interest rates. They're trying to the soft landing scenario for the Bank of Canada and for the Federal Reserve for that in the US is they're trying to engineer a soft landing. They're hoping companies will pull back on their job openings without necessarily laying off a lot of people. And so far, it's kind of working out that way. There hasn't been, except for possibly in the high-tech industry, there hasn't been a lot of layoffs across the economy. So things are looking okay for for central banks right now, but we'll have to see. The job vacancy rate, which is just the percentage of it's the number of job openings as a share of the total number of jobs and the total number of job openings, has also been coming down lately. So it's below 5% now, but you can see it's still relatively elevated compared to where we were before the pandemic. Another way to look at one reason why there's been a shortage of workers is the fact that there was a very, very swift recovery in the sector, one of the fastest recoveries among all industries from the pandemic. In fact, it took only a matter of months, about 6 months from the start of the pandemic to a full recovery in employment. So we saw a massive drop in employment in the first wave of the pandemic, and then by October 2020, we're back to where we were before it even started. It's been pretty up and down since then, but still, even today, employment is just slightly above its pre-pandemic level. So a full recovery in manufacturing. I'm not showing it here, but the unemployment rate's really low too. So what happens? I mean, what happens when you can't find workers? Well, the most logical thing for a company is to offer higher pay. And this right-hand side chart shows you exactly that's what's happening in manufacturing. In fact, in December 2022, which is the last month for which we have data, wage growth in manufacturing on a year-over-year basis was over 8%, which is very, very strong, second highest on record, and well above historical average growth of 2.5%. So you can see it's a really big issue for manufacturers. It's really pushing up costs for companies, and we'll see. I'll show some reasons why this is happening next, and if we're going to see any kind of relief coming in the coming quarters. So one of the reasons, there's cyclical reasons why we've had such difficulty finding workers, and there's structural issues too. I'm going to focus on a couple of cyclical ones first. One issue that was probably keeping some people on the sidelines was really generous COVID supports from the federal government. One thing they did was, of course, was the CERB. That was the first program that was launched at pretty fairly early in the pandemic, the Canadian Emergency Response Benefit, which transitioned into the Canadian Recovery Benefit a little bit later. But so what the chart on the left shows you is how much money was paid out per quarter. And this is just to show you that issue is really shouldn't be much of an issue anymore, since the last few quarters there's been those programs were eliminated and gone. Something else on the right-hand side the government did was they offered temporary EI, or employment insurance measures, among other things, shorten the number of hours required to qualify. So that also resulted in a fairly hefty jump in the number of EI recipients, but those temporary relief measures expired at the end of September. And in fact, we've seen the number of EI recipients fall pretty precipitously in recent months. In fact, the last number for the last month for which we have data, November, there was less than 400,000 Canadians on EI, which is the lowest number since they started tracking these numbers in 1997. So it's there's not a lot of people getting EI payments right now. Another cyclical reason, I think this is a bigger issue today, why we're having trouble finding workers, is really we're living through an era of illness, high virus transmission. Some people call it triple-demic because it involves COVID, RSV, and the flu at the same time. And what we've seen happen is a lot of people off sick, and much more than usual, So the left-hand side shows hours lost due to illness. I made it at a 12-month moving average to make it to smooth it out, because it tends to be volatile. And what it shows, the gray line is the pre-pandemic trend. The red line is the actual number. So this is hours lost. You can see there was a bit of a jump when the pandemic started in the spring of 2020. Things started getting back to normal, and then a big jump up when Omicron arrived, and it really hasn't come back down. So you have a lot of people. So these are people that do have a job still, but they're taking at least some of the week reference week off because they're sick. The right-hand side is a little bit of a similar but different issue. So these are people that are ill, but they're so sick that they're not even working or not even looking for a job, but they want to work, and they would try to work if it wasn't for the fact that they were too sick to do so. So we've seen a very similar jump in this too. So there's so for instance, the last data we saw in November, over close to 120,000 Canadians were in the situation where they weren't working, weren't looking for work, but they wanted to, but they were sick. So this is some people have considered this maybe a proxy for long COVID. We don't really have, long COVID's clearly playing a role today, but we just don't. The estimates vary how many people actually are suffering with long COVID, but I do think it's something to keep an eye on. And what could be happening, what economists think could be happening now is that, and this is why employment's really high right now, is that companies actually have a higher payrolls today because they have to help cover people that are sick. So compared to the pre-pandemic world, today companies need more workers than they did before because they just have more people ill than they did before the pandemic started. And of course, the big structural issue facing the Canadian labor force, beyond these cyclical issues that have kind of cropped up during COVID, is the aging of the population. Again, this is Canadian data. So the retirement rate is a good signal for what's happening. The baby boom generation, the oldest baby boomers turned 65 in 2011, 2012. So that's really when you start seeing the retirement rate really start to pick up steam. So I should define this. The retirement rate is this is the left-hand slide. I forgot to title it. It's the percentage of workers of the labor force that retired in the previous year. So it's well above 1% these days, actually above around 1.3% these days. So when will this end? Well, the youngest baby boomers are going to turn 65 in about 2031. So we have roughly a little bit less than 10 years left in this trend of this large demographic group exiting the labor force. So it's going to take a few more years to get through this, and it's going to obviously cause challenges finding workers through that period. What does this mean for manufacturing? So the right-hand side is job openings in manufacturing. It's a little bit of an old projection from Employment Social Development Canada. They were supposed to have a new forecast out before the end of last year, but it's late right now, but hopefully it comes out soon. But still, it kind of gives you a sense of what's happening, what's going to happen going forward. This goes out to 2028, and it gives you different categories of why companies look for workers. One, the red bar is because I'm expanding. I need more workers to fill that demand. The blue bar is I need to replace my retiring workers, and the green bar is a little more dark, but it's people do leave the country, and some people unfortunately die while they're working. So we got to replace those workers too. But what this chart shows you that by far the biggest area of demand or replacement need for manufacturing is retiring workers. They represent about 70% of the projected job openings over the next up to 2028 in manufacturing. So on average, there's about 50,000 or so job openings expected to happen in manufacturing every year, and of those, about 40,000 are just to replace retiring workers. So it's going to be unfortunately, I guess it's not great news, but the labor issues we're facing, are going to remain a challenge going forward. Government obviously is raising immigration rates to try to offset this, but it's still a really difficult problem to solve. All right, moving on to inflation and supply chains, another obviously huge issue affecting the economy today. So we focus a lot on supply chain issues that happened during the pandemic. And one thing I wanted to point out is that demand was a big issue. So this chart shows household spending, inflation-adjusted household spending on goods, just goods, not services, in Canada and the US. The gray lines in both charts are pre-pandemic trends of spending, and the red lines are actual trends. So in Canada, you can see that today real spending in Canada is roughly around its pre-pandemic trend, maybe a bit below. But in the US, spending on goods has been well above pre-pandemic levels for many, many quarters since the pandemic started. Well, I don't have to tell you, the US consumer is a very powerful force in the world economy. And it has definitely had a big impact on the supply chain issues we're facing. This huge demand for goods coming from the American consumers is one of the key aspects behind the supply chain issues we've seen. Obviously, workers off sick was probably the predominant reason, but this is something that needs to be pointed out too. And this kind of gives you a sense that given that spending was so high in the US and above pre-pandemic trends, you can make a pretty strong case here that the fiscal spending in the US was too generous. Another thing that's caused high inflation, especially in 2022, was a big run-up in energy prices in the world, which happened right around the time Russia invaded the Ukraine. Natural gas prices jumped too. The WTI crude oil price jumped too, and that's helped keep inflation going. This is obviously, higher oil prices is generally good news for Newfoundland and Labrador, but we have seen prices fall in recent quarters or recent months as concerns over the disruption caused by Russian sanctions ease a bit. The global economy is cool too. That's also helped bring prices down. But you do see, if you look at this chart here, that the gray line, that oil prices have picked up or stabilized a bit in the last few weeks, and that is a lot to do with the fact that China has reopened and demand for oil is increasing there. So it's definitely, energy prices appear to be stabilizing right about now. And given the more positive outlook for the global economy, it's probably a bit positive for crude oil prices going forward, although I guess kind of strangely, or ironically, there's also concern that because the world economy's doing better than expected, it also means interest rates are going to go higher than expected. So that's also putting downward pressure on oil prices. So in Canada, consumer price inflation has been obviously a major challenge. This chart shows the inflation going back to 1971. I put the gray bar in here is the Bank of Canada inflation target, which started in 1991. The black line is the actual target of 2%, but they actually, if you read the mandate, it's more about keeping inflation within 1 to 3%, which is represented by the gray bar, averaging 2% over time. And this chart shows they've done a really good job of keeping that target until recently. Obviously, things have gotten out of hand the last year or so, and they're facing their biggest challenge today. But I guess the good news is that inflation appears to have peaked in June at 8%, and now it's fallen pretty fast and hit 6.3% in December. So it's come down almost 2 full percentage points in a matter of months, and I think it's going to keep doing so for the next few months too. And why is that? Well, you can look at inflation. When people in the media talk about inflation, they always cite the year. They tend to cite the year-over-year change, but you can also get glimpses of a good sense about what's happening when you look at different time periods. And this is month over month. So this is inflation in every month last year, from January to December. I think it's one of those charts that kind of gives you a good sense about what happened. Well, what you can see is that the high inflation that happened in Canada was really a first half of the year story. So in the first half of 2022, average monthly inflation was 1%, which is very strong. Historically, monthly inflation tends to run about 0.3%. So over more than triple the average growth. But you can see since July, inflation has been average zero. There's been no monthly inflation in the Canadian economy in the last 6 months. Well, why is that? Oh, that's a lot of it's to do with the fact that energy prices started falling, but you're also starting to see the impact of interest rate hikes to really start to push down inflation. So I think, so when you hear like the Bank of Canada, they said last week they're confident that inflation is going to fall to about 3% by the middle of this year. Why they're confident? Because inflation really hasn't been an issue for several months now. So they're confident that that's going to keep going on. So a good to finish off on the supply chain story here, a good indicator of what's happening with supply chains is looking at what the price of containers are. Something that economists have been keeping an eye on during the pandemic. We can see there's a huge run up in prices for a 40-foot container. It peaked in September 2021 at over $10,000, whereas before the pandemic, it was less than $2,000. But since the fall of 2021, the prices for global containers have fallen by 80%. So we're not quite back at the pre-pandemic level, but we're pretty close, which is a good kind of gives you a good sense that the supply chain challenges we're facing have eased to a great extent. It's not all because supply has worked itself out, but it's also to do with the fact that demand for goods has cooled quite significantly in line with rising interest rates. So things are looking up on that in that sense, but we're obviously not out of the woods yet. There could be, there still are some labor, obviously the labor shortages I've talked about in manufacturing. There's still labor shortages in transportation and logistics. COVID outbreaks in China, all these things continue to complicate the recovery, and we'll have to keep monitoring going forward. So looking at the Canadian economy now, one of the interesting trends over the last several months is that there's been a big jump in Canadian exports, at least in nominal terms, or when you don't adjust for prices. Why is that? Well, the prices for a lot of goods that we export jumped pretty strongly, especially after Russia invaded the Ukraine. We were, Canada, to be honest, Canada did benefit from our role in filling in the export commodity supply void caused by the Russian invasion. So prices for oil, gas, grains, and other commodities rose pretty strongly, and that's been why energy exports, for instance, were so strong over the last several months. Even today, they're still about energy exports in Canada are still double where they were before the pandemic started. Non-energy exports have also been fairly robust in nominal terms. They're up about 20% compared to the pre-pandemic level. So that's something that's really kept the Canadian economy going while the domestic economy was weakening with higher interest rates. So that's explains when I show the numbers soon why the Canadian economy performed a little more strongly than expected last year. Another thing that's happened with these jump in prices that in goods that we export is that Canada has been running a trade surplus for many months of the pandemic, which is a reversal of what happened before in recent times. We typically been running deficits for many years, but the trade balance has been in a surplus position for a long time until recently. The December data just came out just as I was starting, and exports fell again in December, and we ran another trade deficit. So it's certain the thing's starting to turn again. But for several months, Canada has been running a trade surplus. So again, that bringing all that extra money into the economy has helped support it during this difficult time of rising interest rates. And when I talk about rising interest rates, here we go. So this is a good way of looking at it, I think. So what this chart shows is the change in the Bank of Canada's target policy interest rate. The starting point is 0. So this shows you since 1997, over the last 25 years or so, the Bank of Canada has gone on 7 rate tightening cycles. So 7 periods where it's raised interest rates. And what this shows, if you look at the red line, which is the current cycle we're in, this is the furthest and faster than the Bank of Canada has ever gone over the last 25 years. So that explains why this period probably feels a little bit painful to everyone. They've increased the policy interest rate by 425 basis points in less than a calendar year, and that's going to crimp demand in the economy, obviously. And I think it's important to point out that when you look at the historical data of the impact of interest rates, that they tend to, they can take, anywhere up to 18 months to have their full effect. So the Bank of Canada first raised interest rates last March. That was about 11 months ago. So the impact of that first hike still maybe hasn't been fully the economy hasn't seen the full effect of that yet, let alone all the interest rate hikes in subsequent months, including the one they just did a week or so ago. So this is going to continue to have an impact on the economy. It might be interesting to see where this impact is going to be. So this is a study done by the Bank of Canada in 2018 on categories of spending that are most affected by rising interest rates. And it wouldn't be, this stuff isn't rocket science, but it shows that the categories that are most affected by spending are housing and big ticket items. So things that are likely to be funded by debt. So the top ones are, of course, are new home construction and ownership transfer costs. So two sectors related to housing. What I did here is I colored the categories that relate to manufacturing in red. So in most times, vehicle purchases or the auto sector is the sector that's most heavily affected by rising interest rates. Now, I don't think it's going to be true this time because we're in an era of, given the semiconductor shortages affecting the auto sector, there's really large pent-up demand for vehicles today. So I don't know if the impact, I don't think the impact's going to be as great as it usually is. So other sectors that are impacted, manufacturing sectors, include furniture. That's both direct and indirect. Furniture is sometimes funded through debt, but it's also strongly correlated with housing activity. So when housing activity weakens, people tend to spend less on furniture. And if you go all the way to the bottom, the sector that's least affected by higher interest rates is food and beverages. That is obviously, these are mostly necessities. People need to eat. So that doesn't, people tend to, and it's obviously, this stuff isn't funded by debt or financed usually. So small impact. And that has implications for Newfoundland Labrador, given that it's a big sector there. And I'll get into that in a few minutes. So this is just to show you that in Canada, housing is bearing the brunt of the rising interest rates. So the left-hand side is the Housing Affordability Index, which is the share of housing-related costs as a share of household income. And it's the highest it's been since the early 1990s. And if you remember, the early 1990s featured a pretty significant housing crash, especially in Ontario and around Toronto. We haven't seen that yet today, but housing has weakened significantly. And if you look on the right-hand side, you can see what's happened to residential sales. In the latest month road trade data was in December, and in December, sales are down. We're down 39% compared to the same month in 2021, which is actually below pre-pandemic levels. So quite a weak housing market in Canada right now. So this is really where we're seeing the biggest slowdown in economic activity in the country, and that's not really a surprise. Now, housing prices haven't fallen that much. They're down less than 10% year over year, and a lot that has to do with the fact that people have pulled back on the number of listings, and that's helped to stabilize the sector. So another thing to keep an eye on about when you want to think about what's going to happen going forward is to see how confident businesses are about the economy. So this is another Bank of Canada indicator, and this just came out just last week. It's for the fourth quarter of 2022. So they call it the Business Outlook Survey Indicator. So it basically tells you it's the percentage of firms reporting positive sentiment minus the percentage of firms expressing negative sentiment. So in general, when it's above 0, you have more firms that are confident than not, and when it's less than 0, more firms have a negative outlook than a positive one. So we can see that right now, or in the last quarter, it basically fell to 0. So looks like we're heading towards a negative sentiment among Canadian businesses. And you can see that the last time that business confidence was really weak coincided with the last 2 recessions, which I put in gray bars. So the global financial crisis and the COVID pandemic. We're not there yet, but definitely businesses are less confident today about the outlook than they were in previous quarters. So that's something to keep an eye on. So what's my outlook for Canada? This is a chart that shows quarterly annualized growth. So last year, the Canadian economy grew by an estimated 3.6%, which again is pretty strong. Surprising. I think if I remember, when I look back at the start of the year, I was expecting growth closer to 3%. So it was definitely a little bit stronger than we're expected. Again, it has to do with the fact that the impact of interest rates hasn't been as severe as people were thinking. Looking ahead, this is a forecast from RBC Economics, but it represents pretty close to the consensus among economists. They have growth slowing sharply to 0.6% this year, followed by a little bit stronger growth in 2024. Now, you can see that if you look at the 2 bars in Q1 and Q2 of this year, they are negative. So that meets the definition of a technical recession. Now, I'm a little bit less confident about a technical recession now than I was a couple of weeks ago, given that the global economic data has been stronger than expected, which should help lift the Canadian economy. But still, I think there's no doubt that the outlook this year is going to be really, really weak. The rising interest rates are going to really keep growth down this year, hold growth down this year, and especially in Canada, given that household debt in Canada is very, very high. It's some of the most indebted households in the world. So we're much more sensitive to higher interest rates. So I think that is going to keep things down. Now, maybe could we avoid a technical recession? Maybe. But still, I don't think you're going to see growth, much stronger than 1% or so this year. Now, I should say the outlook for 2024, one of the reasons it's picking up. This hinges on the assumption that the Bank of Canada and other central banks are going to start cutting interest rates late this year. But the bank, we'll have to see about that. The one thing I should mention is that there is a thing called the neutral rate, which is the policy rate at which inflation typically runs at 2% and the economy grows at its potential. So this is just an estimate, and the Bank of Canada estimates that the neutral policy rate is closer to 2.5–3%. So the interest rate, the policy target rate today is 4.5%. So it's higher than the target rate, which means that you should, if their estimates are correct, we should see growth fall pretty significantly, we should see inflation fall below 2% because of these high interest rates. And this will force the bank to quickly reverse course later this year and start cutting rates as inflation falls below 2%. But we'll see. Again, the outlook's been the data coming in tends to be more stronger than we're expecting, so than we anticipated. Still, weak growth this year, pick up next year. So in terms of manufacturing, I guess there's two ways of looking at what's happening in manufacturing in Canada. You can look at it in nominal terms, and you can look at it in real terms. So the nominal data again is data where we leave in all the price changes that the economy's seen or manufacturer has seen over the last several months. Whereas real data takes these inflation changes out and just assumes that prices haven't changed. Prices have remained constant over time. So in nominal terms, things are looking quite rosy. Manufacturing sales in Canada are up quite significantly compared to where they were before the pandemic started, which is the gray line. They're up about almost 30% higher than they were in February 2020. But if you look in real terms, the situation is a little more not quite as positive. Again, this is data that takes out all the price changes we've seen. So in inflation adjusted terms, manufacturing sales today are basically at their pre-pandemic level. So you have a full recovery in manufacturing, but not much more than that. So what this chart shows you is that in the strong manufacturing sales growth we've seen during the recovery has mainly been driven by higher prices and not higher production. Another trend we're seeing in manufacturing, and this has continued over many months, is that the recovery in manufacturing has been stronger in the US than in Canada. It's almost every month since early in 2021, the US has seen stronger growth than in Canada. Why is that? Well, actually, in the latest data, the US manufacturing production was about 2.5% above its pre-pandemic level, whereas in Canada, it's about 0.5% below. So there's about a 3% gap. 3% gap right now. It's not significant, but it's something to keep in mind. One reason for this is that the structure of the U.S. manufacturing sector is a little more closely related to the goods that were in demand during the pandemic. A lot of that, again, has to do with there was a huge upswing in demand for electronic products during the pandemic, and that makes up a much larger share of the U.S. manufacturing sector than the Canadian one. So, for example, computer and electronic products manufacturing makes up about 15% of U.S. manufacturing, whereas it makes up only about 3% of Canadian manufacturing. Another thing we've seen is that the auto sector has struggled with the semiconductor shortage, and the auto sector makes up a much larger share of manufacturing activity in Canada than in the U.S. So, in terms, this is the outlook that CME has produced. It's fairly new. So it's going to follow trends similar to the Canadian economy overall. Actually, the growth in 2022 looks like it matched the overall economy of 3.6%. So the sector has seen pretty good bounce back from the 2020 collapse. Still, we haven't seen a full recovery yet, but we're getting there. Now, unfortunately, growth is expected to be only about 0.5% this year in manufacturing. That kind of goes to the fact that manufacturing is, especially the durable side of the sector, quite interest rate sensitive. So you're seeing a slowdown there. So durable goods tend to be less in demand when there's high interest rates. Also, sectors that are part of the construction supply chain also tend to see weaker activity. Again, with housing construction down, all those manufacturers in that supply chain also tend to struggle a bit. Next year should see a pickup to about 2.1%, which is outpaces the overall economy. Here's quickly a subsector outlook. These are more the bigger subsectors in Canada. I guess I'd point out a couple of things here. I do have transportation equipment leading growth over the next 2 years. That's under the assumption that supply chain issues affecting the automotive industry continue to ease, which is no sure thing, but some of the data look fairly promising. I don't think those issues aren't ending anytime soon, but they are getting better month by month, and they do have a lot of catching up to do. So they should see strong growth over the coming years. Other sectors that are expected to struggle, wood product is one that I should point out. It's a sector that really boomed during the pandemic, but activity there has waned quite a bit over the last few months, and that's expected to continue this year, largely to do with obviously the slowdown in housing activity. So another thing before I end this section, another major challenge affecting the Canadian manufacturing sector or the Canadian economy is weak investment. One way to show this is to compare what's happening in Canada versus the US. We can see that one way to look at it, the left-hand chart is non-residential business investment as a share of GDP. So how much business investment accounts for economic activity. And you can see in the US, it's close to 15%, whereas in Canada, it's only about 11%. The collapse that we saw in this indicator stemmed from a collapse of investment in the oil sands that started when oil prices fell in late 2014. There hasn't been a recovery. There was a hope that manufacturing would come in and fill the gap, but that just hasn't happened. And we can see that in the right-hand side of the chart. So this is manufacturing investment, the percentage change since 2004. Over the last 15 years or so, we can see that since 2004, manufacturing investment in the US has grown by over 50%, whereas in Canada, it's actually fallen by 1.5%. So quite a dramatic difference in manufacturing and manufacturing trends in the two countries. So this is a major, along with labor shortages, this is a major challenge affecting manufacturing in Canada, and something that CME is quite focused on. What happens when you don't invest in manufacturing? Well, you don't produce, your production is weak, and you don't export as much, and you end up with a pretty massive trade deficit in manufactured goods. So I had mentioned that Canada has run a trade surplus in the last several months, but that is all to do with commodities, basically. So we run a pretty significant and growing trade surplus in commodities, and we have run a pretty significant and growing deficit in manufacturing goods. So that is something that's hopefully needs to change, especially if we talk about reshoring. So this is an index that people are starting to track. It's called the manufacturing import ratio. And what it shows you is you divide imports from 14 low-cost Asian countries, and you divide these imports by domestic manufacturing production. So the left-hand side is imports from Asia to Canada divided by manufacturing GDP in Canada, and the same thing on the US. So you can see there's little sign of reshoring yet. So reshoring happens when this number is positive, and I have those bars in black. So you can see since 2007, both the US and Canada have only seen 2 years of positive reshoring. I'm not expecting this to turn around right away, because all the strategies and the policies that are being put in place to encourage reshoring they're going to take some time to have an effect. So we won't see these in the numbers for a while. If they do, and if they do have it's too early to say if these policies are going to be successful. But if they are going to be successful, we will see it in these numbers, and we will see it, but not for some time. So let's move on to Newfoundland and Labrador to wrap up my presentation. So a couple things about kind of the structure of the sector in the province. Now, the left-hand side is manufacturing share of GDP. Compared to other provinces, it is fairly low. But that has to do with the fact that it's the energy sector is such a massive share of the economy that, in comparison purposes, every other sector in Newfoundland and Labrador is just small. So it has been falling over time, though, the share, but it's kind of stabilized around a little bit under 3% over the last few years. But the right-hand side shows the total economic impact in level terms. So the point of this is that even though we do a direct measure of the sector, it's not significant, but when you add in its supply chain or spin-off effects, it does have a pretty big footprint in the province and in the country. And why does manufacturing have such big spin-offs, or what economists call a big multiplier? Is that, well, a lot of it has to do with the fact that it is an export-oriented industry. So by selling its goods abroad, it brings new income into Canada, Newfoundland, and Labrador, as opposed to many other sectors that just recirculate income already present in the economy. So it tends to bring in more, help lift prosperity in a province or in a jurisdiction, and that's why when I just showed you the trade deficits in Canada, the manufactured goods, that's concerning about future prosperity. In terms of the top industries in Newfoundland and Labrador, by far the food industry is number one. So it represents a significant share of GDP, as well as a significant share of employment. In fact, it represents about half of all total manufacturing employment in the province. The sector has about, give or take, about 9,000 workers and 4,000 work in food. And if you wanted to break that down more, most of it is in seafood, product preparation and packaging. It accounts for about, seafood accounts for about 80% of food manufacturing. So that's kind of gives you a sense of the structure. Other big industries include primary metal, beverages, and non-metallic mineral products, and paper. So what's happening, looking at recent trends? Well, this is not going to be the most positive story here, but this is what the data is telling us. So if you recall, when I talked about when I showed you the Canadian numbers recently, merchandise exports in nominal terms were quite strong. Manufacturing sales in nominal terms were also quite strong relative to the pandemic level, but we're not seeing this in Newfoundland and Labrador, unfortunately. So these are again in nominal terms. They're again taking into account the price changes we've seen over the last 2 years. Merchandise exports were doing pretty well in late 2021, early 2022, but over the last several months they have fallen down again, most likely due to the kind of follows the change in the price of oil. Manufacturing sales, you saw a pretty significant drop at the beginning of the pandemic. So whereas in other provinces you saw a pretty swift rebound and a very strong recovery, you have not seen much of any recovery to date so far in manufacturing sales in the province, unfortunately. Now I'm trying to figure out this. First another thing to show about kind of just to highlight the fact that Newfoundland and Labrador is a bit of an outlier. This shows you average annual growth in manufacturing sales by province over the last 5 years, up to 2021, not counting 2022. So you can see it's the only province that has seen a decline in manufacturing sales over these 5 years, and much weaker than the Canadian number, which is at 3.2%. So again, another sense that recovery that we've seen in manufacturing hasn't, in nominal terms at least, hasn't happened in Newfoundland and Labrador. Now, one thing I'm trying to figure out what's happened here. Perhaps, I don't know, I would be happy to hear other people's thoughts as we go through the Q&A soon. Here's one idea I have, is that we've seen big jump in prices for many products, but we haven't seen it to great extents in seafood products. So the red line is a raw material price of fish, crustaceans, shellfish, and other fishery products. So this is these are input prices. So these are the prices that manufacturers pay for inputs to production. You can see that prices, going back to the beginning of the pandemic, prices for fish products are up 40%. The blue line is a industrial product price for prepared and packaged seafood products. So this is the price that manufacturers charge when a product leaves the factory gate. You can see prices for this have barely moved during the they're just basically back up to where they were before the pandemic started. Well, they're up about 4%. So the price that manufacturers are paying for the incoming for the input is up 40%, but the price that they're selling it for is up only 4%. So it's just maybe this could be an issue affecting the sector. But happy to hear other people's thoughts. In terms of the labor market, the manufacturing labor market in Newfoundland and Labrador, employment's surprisingly, even though the sales haven't come back at all, or have been pretty stagnant since the pandemic started, employment's come back. In fact, it hasn't been that affected by the pandemic. It's basically at the same level where it was before the pandemic started. About 9,500 people work in the manufacturing sector in Newfoundland and Labrador, which is okay. Now, another outlier is the unemployment rate, though. It's pretty high. In fact, the unemployment rate in December 2022 was just under 20%. So it's the only province that has a double-digit unemployment rate in manufacturing. So there are a lot of people, according to this data, who are working who are looking for a job in manufacturing. So it's kind of interesting that there are obviously labor shortages are a big issue in Newfoundland and Labrador, but there are people looking for work. So it could speak to again, I'm just hypothesizing, could speak to a skills mismatch. Another thing that shows you that there are, the labor market maybe isn't as tight. The manufacturing labor market isn't as tight in Newfoundland as it is in other provinces. Is that the Newfoundland and Labrador has the lowest job vacancy rate in the country as of 2022 Q3. So in Canada, 4.8% of all jobs in manufacturing were open or available. The highest is PEI, 8.1%. It's also high in Quebec, but in Newfoundland and Labrador, it was only 1.7%. So most jobs were, according to these data, most jobs were filled in Newfoundland and Labrador relative to other provinces. It's another interesting difference about Newfoundland and Labrador. To keep the less than optimistic story going, along with the overall sector as a whole in Canada, manufacturing investment in Newfoundland and Labrador has been fairly stagnant in recent years. So this is a level of investment in manufacturing. You can see that since about 2017, it's been pretty flat around $200 million per year. So not much growth compared to other at all over the last 5 or 6 years. The 2022 number is preliminary, so we don't know if that's real or not, but we'll see when the real data comes out in a month or so. I guess the positive story is that the provincial government did implement a investment tax credit. They announced it in the budget earlier last year, which should help encourage investment, hopefully going forward, and result in more positive investment trends. But the last few years have been pretty tough in that area. So I don't have a manufacturing outlook, but I do have an economic outlook for the province as a whole. This is from Scotiabank. So it has been, the economic recovery in Newfoundland and Labrador has been fairly uninspiring to date. Despite favorable oil prices, economic growth last year was held back by falling oil production. I think crude oil production was down about 25% compared to 2021, related mostly to the fact that Terra Nova remained shut down. Now, the last story I saw that they're still expecting the Terra Nova site to come back online early this year. So given that, we economists are expecting economic growth in Newfoundland and Labrador to pick up this year to 1%. Again, thanks to the planned opening of Terra Nova, as well as the conversion of the Come By Chance refinery. Going forward, a couple other things to end this thing on a positive note is that the major projects such as the Bay du Nord Beta NORAD project could provide additional opportunities or economic activity down the line. So there is some definitely light at the end of the tunnel for Newfoundland and Labrador. Just to show you how it's done vis-a-vis other provinces, and to highlight the fact that Newfoundland and Labrador, hasn't been able to take advantage of these high oil prices as unlike other oil-producing provinces. If you look at the 2022 estimate, you can see again Newfoundland and Labrador estimated growth of just 0.5%, whereas you see in Saskatchewan the estimated growth of 5.2%, and in Alberta estimated growth of 4.7%. So these are two provinces that were able to take advantage of the opportunity there, as opposed to Newfoundland and Labrador. Same thing in 2023, even though growth is expected to pick up to 1%, still trailing what's expected to happen in the prairies. And 2024 of 1.2%, so a little bit better growth over the next 2 years. Looking even bigger down the line, something to keep in mind is when we talk about the aging of the population, it doesn't just result in labor shortages, but it also has huge ramifications for taxation and the ability to pay for services, especially healthcare. So the dependency ratio, which is it's the total number of people that are too young to work or too old to work divided by the people of working age. It's expected to grow pretty significantly in Newfoundland over the coming years. In fact, Newfoundland and Labrador is expected to have the highest dependency ratio. These are 3 scenarios conducted by Statistics Canada. So at a minimum, the dependency ratio is expected to be close to 80% by 2043. So another way, about 1 in 5 people in Newfoundland and Labrador will be working age by 2043, and they will need to care for the other 4/5 of the population. So when you think about what this means for healthcare, this sustainability and the sustainability of fiscal policy, it's definitely a huge issue. So this is a report done by the Parliamentary Budget Office every year. This is the 22 version. This is a little bit maybe a little bit complicated, but maybe just focus on the right-hand side here, which is the fiscal gap estimates by province. So what this shows you is this data goes out, I believe, to like almost 2100. So it's a very, very long forecast, and it shows that when there's a positive number, that shows you that the current fiscal policy is not sustainable. A negative number says that fiscal policy is sustainable. So you can see most provinces are on the positive side of the ledger, unfortunately, and Newfoundland and Labrador is facing, among all the provinces, is facing the most precarious fiscal situation, with a fiscal gap estimated at 3.6% of GDP. Only the territories are are facing more difficult conditions, and this again, why subnational governments are in such trouble is the fact that they are responsible for healthcare, and it probably is also why they're all in Ottawa today asking for money from the federal government, which is notwithstanding all the money they spent over the last 2 years, still their fiscal policy is very much sustainable. And it just basically goes back to the fact they aren't responsible for healthcare. So just to end it on the advocacy strategy that we're working on, I think Dave mentioned a little bit of the stuff we do, and it's all tied to all the challenges I've kind of described today, or three of the four really pillars of our strategy has been talked about today. So a top one is getting the workers we need. Labor shortages are a huge challenge, and it's one of the reasons why, when you talk to companies, why they're reluctant to invest in manufacturing in Canada is because, well, they don't think they're going to find the workers they need to produce the goods they want to produce here. So they tend to look elsewhere for their investment, to put their investment dollars. Also, we are encouraging, I did talk about investment being weak. And of course, something else I didn't really get into was Canada tends to lag other countries in terms of adoption of advanced technologies. So this is another pillar that we're working on, is using government tools to help spur innovation, investment, and the adoption of advanced technologies in manufacturing. Third is encourage domestic production and export growth. This is something else that can be done. Obviously, by working on the first two pillars will help the third, but I think there's still other policies that can put in place to spur domestic production. And fourth, which I didn't really get into today, but one of the big, I'm sure you're aware, but big issues, or the big, the federal government's, I don't want to call it an obsession, but they are one of their top policy priorities is Canada's climate change plan. So, we are working on getting more support to help manufacturers adapt to and advance the government's climate change plan. This kind of help is needed more now than ever since the US in August adopted the Inflation Reduction Act. The government's aware of this. The US government has a lot of subsidies out there for companies to invest in and produce clean technology products in Canada, in the US, pardon me. And Canada's going to need to step up to match some of these subsidies if we're going to have a role to play in clean technology going forward. I guess the good news, CME has had discussions with the government and pretty confident that there will be advanced manufacturing. I don't know if they're going to use the term strategy in the budget, but it's definitely going to be one of the pillars of the budget. My manager had a meeting with Chrystia Freeland just late last year, and she did say that her top priority was in the budget will be climate change, and that'll be followed by some sort of advanced or industrial policy to help match all the subsidies that have been put in place by the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as to help encourage reshoring and friendshoring. So we're hopeful that the budget will have some good news when it comes out, probably in March, but and we're going to keep pushing the government to go in that direction, but we'll have to see. So just to sum everything up before I move into Q&A. So some of the key takeaways from our presentation: global growth is slowing, though the odds of recession have diminished quite a bit. So all the economists that have been arguing that inflation was transitory and would go away, or kind of speaking up a bit now again. They're feeling a little more confident that their worldview was correct, but we'll have to see. We do expect Canada to experience a technical recession in the first half of 2023, but the hopes of a soft landing remain alive. We will have January employment data comes out on Friday, and that'll give us a sense if the labor market in Canada is as strong as it is in the US, and if that'll give us a sense if a soft landing is still feasible this side of the border. Manufacturing activity, it's been cooling over the last several months. It's expected to be fairly weak, and it's same things happening globally. All manufacturing activity across the world, if you look at any kind of data, has been cooling, and that's again to do with the fact that manufacturing is pretty sensitive to interest rates, and interest rates are going up in many parts of the world. Labor markets remain very tight, and labor shortages will continue to be a problem given the demographic situation of the country and of Newfoundland Labrador. Now, I mentioned the immigration targets have been increasing. We keep pushing the government to increase them even higher, and to make other reforms so that more immigrants come in that have the skills and experience needed in manufacturing. So that's something we continue to work on to help not completely solve this issue, but hopefully ease it to a great extent. So that's my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions or comments.
Hi, Alan. We have a question. that you noted we're seeing supply chain issues easing. We have not seen supply chain issues ease in Newfoundland yet. Our members are also reporting high cost of goods and parts that impact trucking and logistics. Can we expect to see these ease as described, or are we unique in our reliance on trucking and labor marketing impacts?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I do hear the same thing from members outside of Newfoundland Labrador, that those issues haven't gone away. And that's why I was trying to hedge a bit when I was talking about these supply chain issues. Like, again, it's not just when we see for instance, the prices of containers fall, it's not just due to the fact that that supply is improved. It's demand. The demand side is really doing a lot of the heavy lifting. Central banks are raising interest rates, and that's really cooling demand for goods, and that's reducing demand for containers, and therefore dropping the price of containers. Another thing that's reducing the price of containers is that there's huge, especially during the crunch time, a lot of companies ordered new containers, ordered new ships. So the supply of containers, supply of ships is growing. That's also going to put pressures down. But I think a lot of those things you're describing around labor shortages, especially in transportation and logistics, I think that's probably going to continue to be an issue going forward, unfortunately. So hopefully it continues to ease as we're moving past this pandemic stage into an endemic stage. But it's still uncertain. The idea that the labor market's going back to normal. I don't know what normal means, right? Like, it's kind of interesting that the most aspects of our lives have mostly returned to normal, but the labor market is one area that just hasn't returned to normal. A lot of it's due to the increased absenteeism we've seen due to illness, and I don't know when that's going to end.
Okay. We have another question that says, you mentioned friend sharing a few times during the presentation. What does that term mean?
If I said friend sharing, I'm sure I meant to say friend shoring, but I guess it's good to share among friends.
It could be a typo.
Yeah, I know. I figure I'm just making light of it. Friend shoring. Well, I guess there's kind of two things. I guess they kind of get mixed together, or two ideas. There's reshoring, which is returning production to North America. But that's one strategy that governments are thinking about. Another strategy is friendshoring, which is it's a different strategy. It's probably something that probably has greater chance of happening. So that would be not just returning that manufacturing production in North America, but moving supply chains away from countries that perhaps are not a force for good, and moving to countries that are better allies. So I guess it's just friendshoring. I guess it's just a metaphor for trying to move supply chains, as much of the supply chain out of China as possible. Right. So that's something, and you can see with the idea of friendshoring is manifested most clearly in the Indo-Pacific strategy, which something the U.S. kind of launched last year, and Canada is joining in that strategy. They made their announcement late last year. So again, that's about working with our Asian allies to try to move as much of the manufacturing supply chain outside of China and into other countries like Japan, Korea, Vietnam, etc., right, or India. So that's kind of, I think that's going to be a major trade story for the next 10 years for sure, about seeing how much we can reduce our reliance on China.
And I have a question about the dependency ratio, and I may have missed it. I'm sure you said it. You said in 2043 it'd be 1 in 5 for Newfoundland. What's the dependency ratio now for Newfoundland?
Oh, let me go back to the slide.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I'm fine. There it is. So I guess in today, just looking at the chart, it looks close to what, like between 55%, say, so a little more than, say, 45% of the population is working, and maybe 55% isn't. But so you're going to see a dramatic increase over the next several years. Now, I would say I can't remember when this projection was made. Newfoundland Labrador has seen, a little bit stronger immigration during the pandemic, and it's probably helped by the fact that we've seen that in the Atlantic provinces, we've seen a move towards or stronger immigration in the Atlantic provinces compared to before the pandemic, which is related to the work from home trend that we've seen over the last several months. When I talk about the labor market not returning to normal, I think that's something else that's not returning to normal, which is office work going back into full-time back to work. I think the work from home or hybrid work is here to stay. So that could be a little bit positive for Newfoundland Labrador if you can work anywhere, and you can't. And it's very difficult to afford a house in Ontario, for instance. Why not move to the East Coast, right? So maybe this could help reduce the dependency ratio, maybe going forward. Again, I don't know when this projection was made, but I'm curious to see when they do the next one, if that will be something they take into consideration or not.
Alan, it's David. I've got 2 or 3 questions for you. I guess one of the things, I believe it was the supply chain management issues survey showed, or maybe it was the skills and labor, that showed, I believe, loss in sales due to not being able to get the workers that we need is somewhere around 13 billion a year. Is there any in lost opportunity? Is there any numbers around what it's costing Newfoundland and Labrador?
Yeah, I don't have it on the top of my head, but I could get a breakdown for you. You're right that was the labor survey we did in the fall of 2022. Yeah, so it was a measure of 3 things. It was lost opportunities, all due to labor shortages. So lost opportunities, penalties paid for late delivery, and the third was delayed or canceled investment projects due to labor shortages. All those things 3 together have a pretty significant impact or a negative impact on the Canadian economy, and that goes right across the country, including Newfoundland Labrador. But I can get that number for you. I just don't have it on the top of my head right now.
You may have some insight on a national level from so it is, we know that we've got, getting the workers that we need, certainly a major challenge, but it's the also the upgrading of skills, whether the governments federally or provincially put money directly into the companies for upgrading skills, or through the other industry associations, colleges, universities. Is obviously we can't get the workers. The ability to attract and retain skilled workers is a major challenge. So any insight onto the, as new people come into the market, upgrading their skills. So it's not just getting them. What kind of trends do you see in regards to across the country of how we're upgrading skills in the companies themselves, or with support from the edges?
Right. Yeah, I think one of the issues is, it's not to get too much into the weeds or the literature, but if you do look at the economic literature on labor, if you look at labor economics research, you do see companies do tend to underinvest in laborers and upskilling their workers, and it's all due to the fact that there's companies are worried about spending money training the workers, and the workers leave. It's a huge issue. And I guess I remember taking it in university, and the biggest the greatest example of poaching happens in among pilots. So people join the Air Force, learn how to fly a fighter jet, and then they get poached away by an airline. So the government spends all the money training the person how to fly, and the pilot moves to the airlines, and the airlines don't pay for any of the training. That's kind of like the classic example of poaching. And I think because of that, companies tend to be nervous or hesitant about it. So I think that does, and something, because of this issue of poaching, it says government should step in and help fix this market inefficiency. So there should be support for companies to help train their workers. And this is something that CME keeps. It's one of our recommendations when we talk about getting the workers we need. So I think it behooves the government to think about. We talk a lot about a worker, employer-led working training tax credit. So companies are some of the cost of training are offset, and I think that would be something that would be very useful and help be one solution among many that could help reduce labor shortages. But I do think the other thing I guess that's at the company level, and in the education sphere, I do think there's too much emphasis on probably not enough emphasis on skilled trades, even though there's a credible opportunity in that field for people, but the education system tends to siphon students into universities and not enough into the trades, and that's something else that needs to be looked at.
I know, and to this, in Newfoundland and Labrador, the provincial and federal governments have been very supportive of CME in upgrading skills inside companies. It is around lean, around leadership, around technology, around green sustainability, innovation. So it's and as well as safety. So but I'm just curious, the Canada jobs grants across the country are all different in different provinces, but it is direct. I know we've lobbied for direct investment to the companies for upgrading of skills.
Yeah, no,
in different divisions, right?
Yeah. The Ontario government has been there's been a lot of positive moves in Ontario on that front. They've started I forget the name right, Skills Ontario or Ontario Skills. I don't know if I'm getting that in the right order, where they're definitely looking at again offering more support to companies to upgrade and upskill their workers. So there is movement in that area. I know, talking to CME in BC, there's similar things going on there too. So for sure, I think more support's needed, but the government seems to be, waking up more to that issue of the capacity, the lack of capacity in this country for those kind of skilled workers that we need.
We have another question in the chat, Alan. What do you think would happen if, I'm going to say this wrong, Poilievre and CPC wins the next election? What are the positive or negative policy implications for manufacturers?
Yes, I saw that. Yeah, okay, I see that question. Yes, that's a good question. Well, I guess my baseline assumption is that I don't think much would change, but trying to game it out a bit. I do find this Pierre Poilievre does appear to be a little more have more, well, obviously compared to Liberals, more free market thinking. So I had just mentioned, I ended the presentation talking about all these supports that the Liberal government's thinking about implementing in the budget, mostly around clean technology to offset the IRA. I'm not sure if that CPC would be, they'd probably be focused more on, more perhaps tax cuts versus subsidies. That'd probably be something they're thinking about more. I guess the main difference to me would be around the climate change plan. I know Pierre Poilievre says they would, if they came into power, they would get rid of the carbon tax, but I'm skeptical that much would change in the climate change plan, given that it's embedded in policy already in everything the government does. So once you start a major policy like that, it's really difficult to unwind the tape and try something else. But I think they would have different ideas about climate change, the environmental policy for sure. But again, I think a lot of the pressure to reduce emissions is coming internationally, and that's not going to change no matter who's in power.
Alan, across the country, do you have any statistics or any economic outlook of rural versus urban? Whereas, and I'll use Newfoundland as an example, of around 4,000 people work in seafood, but it's got the seasonality. Right now, this time of the year, it's minimal. Maybe there's 1,000. In another month and a half, there will be 3,000 people added to that sector. And it is, I'd also say with forestry lumber products, depending on how much snow we get, the difficulty of getting into the woods, right? So there's certainly, we have a high unemployment rate, somewhere around 20%. It is, but there is a great seasonality to that. So just in regards to, do you see trends across the country of when it comes to skills and labor, urban versus rural?
Yeah, I don't have exact statistics, but I think the seasonality story you're talking about is something that's more unique to the Atlantic provinces than anywhere else in the country. To be sure, they are issues in Canada. I mean, not necessarily manufacturing. I think when I think of seasonality and a lot of the other parts of the country, a lot of it's related around, probably tourism and stuff like that, like more on the services side, or agriculture. That's why we do. It's probably why you think of if you look at the two sectors that have the highest numbers of temporary foreign workers, it tends to be accommodation and agriculture. So that probably those temporary foreign workers probably help fill in those, those peak demand seasons in the rest of the country. But I guess generally, like, there has been, if you look at a lot of economic growth, or the great extent of economic growth in Canada, and this is true for any developed country, has been happening in big cities. And you have this trend of urbanization has been going on for a long time, but it still continues. Every year, more people live in cities compared to the rural areas. And I don't think that's going to change that much, except the issue of housing affordability is a really big issue in Canada. So is pushing people to more rural areas. And again, the working from home trend is also enabling people to live in smaller locations too. So I think those kind of things are offsetting each other. But I don't see a great issue revolving around seasonality and manufacturing like there is in Atlantic Canada.
Guys, I know that it is I know we've booked this for an hour and a half, but I think for the most part, Amy and Wanda, there are no additional questions. I want to thank everybody today, including Alan. Thank everyone for coming here today. I want to thank ACOA and IET for their support of Manufacturing Insights. Traditionally, with this kind of information, as well as the management issue surveys, we share with federal, provincial governments. It's good information to have at our fingertips, and great job today. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for joining today. Appreciate it.